Alrighty, cool. So, something experimental today. This isn't, I guess that's one way to describe it. I'm with Jeremy. So, Jeremy, tell me a bit about yourself. What do you do? Why are you in school?
Well, my name is Jeremy R. Smith. I'm a PhD student in my second year at the Theory Center at Western. I have my BA and MA in Media and Cultural Studies, so a lot of theory and philosophy has kind of been peripheral, but yet necessary for some of my research in the past, and so is the case now. Going into my second year and kind of figuring out what it is I want to do for my dissertation, and decided that one of the things that I'm interested in for my research particularly is the work of François Laruelle, which we'll be discussing today a little bit more in depth, and to kind of discuss the relationship that he has to political thought, political theory. So a lot of the work that I've done in the past year, amateurly translating a lot of work for my own benefit, but lately I also just published, with permission from the Laruelle kind of family, to bootleg Introduction to Generic Sciences.
Yeah. Didn't he say he wanted to be bootlegged, or he wanted to be, he didn't care about being...
He likes to be bootlegged, he likes to be hacked. I think also it's in the spirit of that book in particular that a lot of the material should be pirated and shared and kind of distributed in a way that is non-institutionally bound. So, and I'm not using non in that sense, with non-philosophy, but ways in which that are, outside of the normal conventions of how knowledge is kind of shared in the first place. So, my research, to be very straightforward, I'm kind of interested in Laruelle's notion of politics of invention, and relating that the notion of invention to fiction that he draws on in his work. Fiction has an etymological link to invention, and trying to draw that out through his relationship with Marxism. So I've kind of subtitled this work from post-Marxism to non-Marxism, and a lot of his early works are dealing with the post-Marxist question, drawing from Nietzsche and Deleuze, Derrida, and a lot of other thinkers in that period. But it becomes a little bit more apparent through his transition to non-philosophy proper that a lot of these terms kind of become latent, as it were, something that you have to draw out and express in ways that not a lot of people can relate to immediately. So, especially with non-philosophy, what does that mean in the first place? Not a lot of people understand that concept, especially in contemporary philosophical landscape, or they try to lump him in with speculative realism, for instance, or try to relate all the notions of fiction to a literary genre,
right?
It kind of, to make it blunt, I feel like it sterilizes the work. It just it loses that power, the potency of that work in relation to political theory in the first place. So what I'm interested in is in trying to bring that out a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because just from you saying that, it sounds like these attempts to make his thought at least applicable not only fail to get at the core, like what you said, but it kind of renders it banal, like just some kind of like you said, speculative realism, something that is probably gaining some kind of speed today, but certainly as it's coming up in various literary circles, like you said, and just being something that we willy-nilly has no real impact in the world. But if you want to dabble in those kind of dark arts, you can go ahead, you can have fun, but it's not going to get you anywhere. So that's noble to try and locate his work into a real kind of praxis. Theory is my praxis, so to speak. So yeah, summary of non-philosophy. This one's a difficult one because it's like, where do you start? Because you don't start by saying, at least I don't think, by defining what is non-philosophy, because that is exactly what he's doing. So let's do this first. What exactly does he mean by philosophy, if you have an answer to that? Because he sketches it as being one thing, and non-philosophy being the thing that kind of responds to it.
So philosophy, in Laruelle's terms, is a very general kind of notion, but it has a very specific rendering. And one of the questions that is always posed to Laruelle is, can't philosophy do this? What is non-philosophy if philosophy already does this? It critiques itself, it deconstructs itself, it seeks to do textual analysis or a genetic or genealogical account, or the philosophy of history in a Hegelian sense, or anything like that. So one of the things that Laruelle finds, and I think this is a quasi-technical term, think of it as like a Turing machine. This is a thinker who has all the given material of philosophy. It doesn't matter whether or not it's a historical account or through a genealogical account or anything like that. Philosophy has a thing that he observes, what he calls the principle of sufficient philosophy. That philosophy alone can be able to articulate its own kind of account of religion, of history, of sexuality, of technology, and so on and so forth. When it seeks its exit from itself, the Ausgang in Marxist terms, it is only imagining that it's outside of itself. Like, it's trying to itself, but it doesn't actually do that. The exit is part and parcel of philosophy. So Laruelle says that one of the things that questioning this exit, this Ausgang from philosophy, have we ever really entered in philosophy? Have we ever really entered the school of Plato's academy, as it were? Have we really become geometrists in that kind of sense? And I think that philosophy as a term is more of a material aspect. It's like, it's more of like, you can point to it and look at the text itself, or look at the thought in the work and how it's able to think itself sufficiently, and how it encloses itself within that kind of own enclosure of thought. So philosophy for Laruelle is not so much like the thing to destroy, really. It's to think about how to invent new forms of thought alongside or parallel to philosophy's kind of like auto-encompassing discipline. So a lot of this non-philosophy is supposed to think through the critique, a radical critique of the principle of sufficient philosophy. A lot of this is related to the notion of a science of philosophy. And Laruelle has spent over 40 years trying to develop this science of philosophy. This is not something that, like, you can just willy-nilly develop from, like, naively.
Right.
You have to mature it over time. And a lot of this is geared towards a coincidence in thought at a moment where difference has become synonymous with the thing that it's critiquing, identity, and that it's become a standard form of thought, and it's always in relation to, like, the three fundamental terms in philosophy: being, the other, and the one. And we'll probably discuss this a little bit more in depth. But philosophy is science and philosophy are the two kernels, as it were. And the thing is, science is not the other of philosophy. Philosophy is the other of science. And I think that in its relationship with Marxism, with Nietzsche, and to some extent psychoanalysis, this kind of thing comes to be a symptomological account. So there is a symptom of philosophy, the thing that identifies itself as such, its sufficiency, its positionality, its givenness. So that's all I could say about like what is philosophy in a Laruellian sense. So it doesn't necessarily have a specific kernel except that sufficiency.
Yeah.
But it's all across the board a generalization. It makes a decision, as it were.
Right. So when Laruelle is writing against it, he's not just worried with what the limitations that it experiences with itself, but the kind of audacity that it experiences when discussing anything else. Where I feel like he's trying to, get at the heart of, what philosophy is by critiquing its, the kind of recurring ideas that come up whenever it discusses anything, or what he calls a kind of the regional disciplines and sciences, as though, we can just take this blanket thing called philosophy that, if I'm correct, that he says comes to privilege being and the other over the one, and then takes that as being like the template from which to regard anything else. So for me, and this is where, if you hear anything I say wrong, tell me. Laruelle seems to be trying to go in reverse, where it's like, what can we get from any of these disciplines, treating them not as simply, some otherness to a kind of, unitary or singular or primary being, but as a one, as a thing in itself.
Yeah. And
I use the thing in itself, so to speak, not exactly, the Kantian way.
Right.
But what can that then tell us about philosophy? So yeah, that's my kind of understanding of it.
It's one way of like focusing on it. One of the statements that Laruelle makes in one of his early works is not to destroy philosophy, but to invent it. How does it come to be? And I'm not saying like a condition of possibility in a Kantian sense or anything like that, but to think through conditions of science through a scientific method, as it were, to approach philosophy, to experiment with it as materials, not so much as like a positive science or anything like that.
Yeah.
Like I think that if you relate it to a positive science and say like there's a culture of philosophy, bacteria, and then you want to just like investigate it. No, it's more about like, it's closer to experimental science. A lot of the work that he's drawing from nowadays is quantum physics, and dealing with like the notion of superposition and entanglement, and treating that in a non-philosophical way to kind of experiment with this material. But also, it's closer to art in a way. I know that like a lot of people look to this artwork kind of perspective, as it were, for Laruelle's work. Like he has a notion of non-photography, relating it to photo fiction and all these other things. So there's a sort of installational kind of like aspect to this. And I mean, I could also say like there's a sort of Dadaism to it. Like cutting up, one of the words that he uses, although it's related to another thinker named Gilles Gaston Coinger, découpage, like cutting up and everything like that. But it's both an artistic and scientific word. This is something that he's done constantly to talk about the cut of the real, things that cut from everything that's been given to create all these new layers of thought. So to go back to this kind of question about regional knowledges and regional sciences and everything like that, it's it's supposed to be a way of eliminating the authority to any one discipline. One of the things that he discusses is a democracy of thought, a completely equalizing playing field of how all these kinds of neighboring, symptomatic kind of relations to the real are, in essence, equal in the last instance. They are things that you can draw from to develop new experimental ways of thinking. And the way in which Laruelle tries to raise science up, not to like another standard of like thought. It's just that philosophy has an idea of what science is. Heidegger says science doesn't think. Plato says science dreams. So it's like these are philosophical decisions that have limited the scope of scientific experimentation in thought. So by drawing that up a little bit further, every philosopher has their own version of science too, like metaphysics or ontology or all these other kinds of ways of thinking in a scientific manner, which is Aristotelian. This is supposed to be a break from Aristotelian thought in a way, where it's not science as rigorous philosophy. It's not philosophy as a rigorous science. It's the other way around. It's a science as a rigorous philosophy.
Right.
So it's a way of, it looks like philosophy. Non-philosophy, when you read it, it's like, how is this not philosophy?
Yeah.
But of course, that's mimetic. It's something that we are taught to look into habitually, disciplinarily, and all these other things. But really, though, it's weaker than you think it is. And that's where the in my opinion, the political aspect of it comes into play. The way in which it plays with our appearances and our understandings. But we can go a little bit further on, I think.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
There's a lot to discuss.
There is a lot. So, okay. How is this different from just a kind of materialism?
So that's a good question. I don't necessarily think that there's a sort of opposition between non-philosophy and materialism from the get-go.
Sure.
So the thing is, this is in relation to Marxist materialism in a way.
Yeah.
It seeks to start from the concrete to the abstract, or rather the other way around, or whatever. I don't know. I'm a bad Marxist. But it's a way of like starting from real kernels of reality. And I know that like when you look at abstract gobbledygook and thinking like, oh, this is not real, this is just words on a page. I think that if you were to try to treat the content of what he's dealing with, mainly philosophy or science or all these other disciplines, they are material. They are, given aspects from all these other disciplines. One of the things that kind of strikes me in this relationship between non-philosophy and materialism is that it goes back to one of his works, the Minority Principle, Le Principe de Minorité. My French is horrible too, so we're going to get a lot of that today. So this book, Ray Brassier has translated one chapter or one subsection in that book as the decline of matter in the name, the decline of materialism in the name of matter. And I think that Laruelle's work is a type of realism, but it's a way of appropriating the Marxist concept of determination in last instance, which is in Althusser's language, it's the base determines the superstructure in the last instance. So think of it like as an architectural metaphor, as Althusser does of a 2-story house or a building. The base, the level of foundation, and everything like that. But the last instance for Laruelle is completely devoid of empirical and known objects. It's supposed to be this void, not of nothingness, but of like an invariant, something that is indeterminate. So in, this is where the quantum physics comes into play, like indeterminate matter, or, something like the indeterminacy principle in Heisenberg. But the relationship that I find between non-philosophy and materialism is about this indeterminacy, this last instance that has its own radical autonomy. Like, the problem that I find, per se, is related to the notion of matter in materialism. And I think it's just that, as a term, a lot of people have misunderstood this in Laruelle's kind of scope in the first place. I know a lot of Marxists, for instance. I like the guy. I don't want to but J. Mufawad Paul has a book called Continuity and Rupture, and has done a review of Introduction to Non-Marxism by Laruelle. And I get the feeling that the reason why he has such a critique of Laruelle in the first place on the notion of matter is because Marxism was in the title. Yeah. And I don't necessarily want to hinder that guy's career or anything. He's a wonderful scholar, and it's just that, like, when you look at it through a lens of Marxism and not actually look to take a step back outside of that, the notion of matter does not. It's unchangeable. So the notion of matter in Marxism is things that are concrete, And I think that with regards to non-Marxism, it's about indeterminacy and how that could be used in a Marxist landscape. And I think that if that was actually looked into with the minority principle and also elaborated a little bit further on in a lot of the secondary works on Laruelle, you might be seeing something different.
Sure.
A lot more better interpretations of this work. But like I said, it's hard because this is 40 years of material that you can't not a lot of has been translated in the first place. So
yeah,
that's the difficulty of it all.
I was speaking to a friend of mine, and he was saying, it's kind of an aside, but when he was reading Laruelle, he felt like he was dropped in media res, and how I said it, I was like, I'm halfway through a movie that I didn't see the first half, I don't know what's happening. But that doesn't mean we can't pick up the pieces here.
No.
So, okay. What now? Non-philosophy. What is it trying to do?
Well, that's always a good question. I feel like a lot of these are good questions. Yeah. And it's hard to speak about because a lot of it is in written notion.
Sure.
A lot of us are very accustomed to have something written down. Yeah. For instance, the textual elements of it, the hyphens and the brackets, the bracketing of intentionality and everything. It's a visual cue. So a lot of this is not directly communicated, and I think that that's a difficulty. So when people speak about this, it's hard for one to recognize that this is one looking to break from all-encompassing thought. Not everything has to be thought in one manner. It has to be thought in several manners. One way of thinking of this is his wife, Anne-Françoise Schmid, has a notion of collective intimacy,
okay,
where a scientist, a philosopher, an artist, some other people can come together and subtract from their discipline what makes up their discipline in the first place. So it's looking to kind of remove or equalize the playing field of thought, as it were, democracy of thought. That's one way of doing it. The second, and this is part and parcel why I feel as though this is related to Marxism in a way, though it strikes me as a very academic way of doing it, unfortunately, which is the liberation of knowledges. Like I mentioned earlier, that Laruelle liked to be hacked, he liked to be bootlegged, he liked to be pirated, and all these other things. I think that the way in which theory or philosophy has kind of been institutionalized or used for neoliberal kind of like academia as it is nowadays has been kind of like squandering how we actually use that work in everyday life. Not so much in like, oh, how are you going to use this as a philosophy degree or anything like that? No. What is it about the work that gives a liberating feeling in the first place? Everybody gets this ecstatic feeling when they read something that like they get pleasure out of, but also listening and performing the work, as it were, through anything, It's a matter of liberating those kinds of things to be practiced in everyday life. And I think that one of the things that comes to mind is, Marx and Engels' German ideology, where they say in communist society, a man can be a fisherman, a rear cattle in the afternoon, a critic as he has a mind in the evening, without being a fisherman, rearer cattle, or a critic. And this kind of comes to mind with like collective intimacy, like one could be a philosopher, artist, or scientist without becoming one. And I think it also gives us a sense of freedom for who we want to be. Not who we can be or who we should be, but who we want to be. Like, not to have permission to like do the things that we do in the first place. It's something that we seek to kind of liberate for ourselves as, using the contents that we have. That's how I see it, at least. I mean, a lot of people have different interpretations of like how non-philosophy has kind of done you better in the world. But like it gives a sense of like a freedom that's already there, that it just doesn't have that nowadays with regards to like how academia works. People are trained to be who they should be in life, or who they can be in life, not who they want to be. So it's a matter of liberating these kinds of things in the first place.
So that presents one of my first, it's not a concern, but like a point of clarification, where it seems as though non-philosophy is proposing that philosophy is too much plagued by its own logic of sufficiency. It's by its own desire to, approach the world in a very tautological way. It only knows how to do it the way it knows how to do it. So in that sense, it's a total system, right? It's one that sees things only through its own lens. But then he's proposing this non-philosophy, one that's guided by the logic of the one, and you could clarify that because there's probably some nuance into that a little bit. A logic of the one that seems to be in itself a kind of totalism or totality. How do they differ?
So I think that this is a good question. Again, good questions all around. I'm going to be like probably saying this a lot. So the thing is, I think that this comes down to the notion of totality of lived experience and the totality of like accumulative knowledge, and where that kind of knowledge or where that cognition, where that intuition goes. What is it for? If it's an auto-enclosing kind of surface of philosophy, why isn't non-philosophy the same way? I think as I've kind of put the pieces together through my readings and everything like that, lived experience is the term that Laruelle kind of points to. It's vécu, which in French could mean lived experience in the phenomenological, philosophical sense, or something that's lived, as in like the past participle, something that has been already given. So the thing is, what is already given is like the material, like philosophy. It has its knowledges of universals, power, language, sexuality, history. These are all universals of philosophy, in a way. I mean, a lot of the thinkers would disagree with this, but this is a very generalized scope. Whereas lived experience is kind of like the bits and pieces, the symptoms of the immanence of humankind in these kinds of different disparate universals. The point is to kind of extract them like kernels, So the problem is of the one's totalizing, or the one's kind of like unifying tendency or anything like that. I think that the difference that kind of connotes the non-philosophical one with the notion of unity in philosophy, the one in non-philosophy is kind of like this flattening, this collapse of multiple different kinds of things. It removes the notion of a transcendent one. It removes the notion of one's equation with being or one's equation with the other. It seeks to kind of displace and displace and implace, or displace and kind of like implant the kinds of tendencies towards a new destination.
Yeah.
And I think that like a destination as opposed to a destiny, a telos, is kind of like a way of recognizing that once this is removed, the sufficiency from all these different disciplines is removed, there's a way of gravitating towards the one in a way that makes it so that it's more fluid, makes it more, practical in a way that is not so much about like an enclosure. Where philosophy kind of accumulates these kinds of things. Like the notion of totalization and totality have been, I feel like, misguided from like the philosophies of difference, where it's kind of like, don't totalize, don't do this, like it's unethical, like you don't account, like it doesn't account for. No, the thing is, totality, it finds a new life in non-philosophy. It seeks to use these things to totalize in a way that is not supposed to be like the fear that a lot of people have in the first place. It kind of extra totalizes. It kind of does this extraterritoriality, and it's no surprise that like Laruelle uses the term like alien and stranger subject to kind of like give this alienating experience to thought. Something that is alien to thought right now is letting this go, letting all of this go to like this kind of unified force.
Yeah.
And he uses the phrase "force of thought," and "of" is in brackets. And it's related to labor power in Marx and Engels, just Marx generally in capital, but like labor power in French is "force de travail," but like in hyphenation or anything like that. But, force of thought is meant to be a way of looking at the productive forces that kind of determine in the last instance this totality, this unity, all these kinds of things that philosophy seeks to kind of like capture as its all. So the thing is, there's the one and then there's the all. In Deleuze, it's a one all. Like there's no distinction between them.
Sure. Yeah.
But this is kind of it's a weird form of monism.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah.
but it's not a monism in a way. It is, but it isn't.
Yeah.
You know? So this one becomes something inalienable, indivisible, not something that could be divided. Mm-hmm. With unity, there is already an implicit notion of division.
Yeah.
So this is a notion of unification. This is a thing that, like, in a way, in generic science, he talks about idempotence, equal power, pretty much. But it's kind of like an idempotent algebra. An algebra, if you look at like the etymology is a fun thing, but I don't like to resort to it as an essential point of view. But algebra is the reunification of broken parts. You know, if you think of an idempotent algebra, it is completely 1 + 1 = 1. There's no additive kind of force to it. All of it's equalized. Mm-hmm. So how does one get to a democracy of thought? How does one actually get to this democracy practiced without it being related to parliamentarism or, you know, the notions of democracy that we have nowadays? You know? So it's a new way of thinking, in my opinion. Like,
okay, so you might want to correct me on this, but this is how I imagined it. Comparing the kind of totality present in philosophy versus the kind of universalism of non-philosophy, if I can use those terms in that way, just for this moment. For me, I understood it as being, in the case of philosophy, it tells everything what, you know, this is the kind of spectral light we're going to place you under, and you're going to, you know, acquiesce, you're going to submit to it. Whereas non-philosophy, and this is how I understood it, with the kind of the experimental or scientific approach, sought to see what is almost consistent among all the fields that, in a sense, bring them together by their own volition, not something that's imposed, but something that kind of exists under the surface. At least that's how I understood the one. So that's the first thing, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. But then, next thing is where he's kind of obviously constructing a difference between non-philosophy and philosophy. He seems to look under non-philosophy as being one dominated by a logic. Dominated is a rough word, but that kind of portends the logic of a unilateral duality, as opposed to, and I don't think he says it anywhere, but I'm assuming that's just in stark contrast to a dialectic. And I don't know what do you think about that?
Okay, so those are... Okay, so I'm going to try to answer both of these questions.
Cool.
So the first is about universalization and totality, to go back to these kinds of like distinctions, as it were. I think that one of the things is about the use of hyphens and brackets in this way.
Yeah.
Like I said, I think one of the weaknesses of non-philosophy is its textual kind of approach to things, and whether or not this is kind of a remainder of Derrida's influence on Laruelle, it's a whole other
did he, as an aside, did he have a big influence on him?
Yes. So to be very quick, so there's like 5 periods of non-philosophy that have been developed over 40 years. I would argue that there is 6, but you know, I think that like Laruelle doesn't really care about these numbers anymore. It's just stupid. So in this early period, which is like from 1975 to 1980, you know, philosophy 1. He's got 5 books, 4 of which are more fundamental. The first one of his books is a book on Ravaillanc's ontology, Ravaillac being a philosopher of habit and very influential on like Deleuze and Malibu, for instance. But the works that are in question are very heavily about textuality. So these works are, one is called Textual Machines, which is like a critique of Derrida using Deleuze's kind of work, which is not to make it compatible with each other. It's more of like, how does one do a methodical approach to both?
Yeah.
He comes up with like a pseudo particle collider of like a series between a Deleuze and a Derrida. I used this like two pictures in a presentation recently of like two characters from Dragon Ball Z just doing a fusion and just like imagining what Deleuze and Derrida would look like if they put Batara earrings or
Vegito.
Exactly. So that was one of those books where he has like a notion between textual and atextual. And I think the textual and the atextual are kind of elements that were in Derrida and Deleuze that he kind of brought to the fore a little bit further to kind of question Derrida's authority over the linguistic representation of the text, which I feel is like still heavily riddled in this kind of like work. The second book in that is The Decline of Writing, which was followed by interviews with Derrida, Jean-Luc Nancy, Sarah Kaufman, and Philippe Le Coulabarth, I think. Yeah, I think that's all of them, which was kind of a usage of Nietzsche in a way that is very interesting. He comes up with the notion of a minor writing alongside of like a minor literature in the sense of like Deleuze and Guattari's book on Kafka.
Sure.
But treating that in the lens of Derrida's notion of writing in a way that is like unreadable, according to Jean-Luc Nancy. Like there is no readability to this text. It looks like you're stoned, is what he said in the interview. In one of the interviews. Third book, Nietzsche contra Heidegger, which seeks to set up a quadripartite of 4 positions in Nietzsche's work, which is a very... I think that a lot of these books are like somewhat controversial in the history of of his work in a way, because this one in particular, he is saying that Nietzsche is both a fascist and a revolutionary thinker, and that there's nothing wrong with the Nazis interpreting Nietzsche. There's nothing wrong with that. They are falsifiers, but there's nothing wrong with that, is what he's saying. It's what they do with the text. It's what they work with Nietzsche in the first place that matters. So the notion of usage is littered throughout all of his entire corpus. Like, how does one use the materials from philosophy to go beyond it?
Yeah.
And the last book is Beyond the Power Principle, which is also a very controversial text, because it's actually one of my favorites, mainly because it was the first book I roughly translated. But in that book, he's trying to treat the notion of power. How does one move from the meaning of power to the power of meaning? And how does one liberate meaning in French it's sens? So it shares the same link with sense. So there's meaning, sense, and signification. And how does meaning get liberated from sense and signification? And how does it remove itself from how one thinks of power in the first place? So 2 things from those texts, and then to go back to these kinds of things, if you could rephrase the questions when I go back to them, is that Marxist and Freudian politics belong to the prehistory of politics alongside aristocratic and bourgeois politics, is one of the things that he says, which I think is a very profound statement and very, very, very true.
Yeah.
And in order for us to actually move past these kinds of things in the first place, one needs to go in the route that Laruelle is dealing with. And the other is that a quote from, and I know the page number right off the top of my head, page 140 of Beyond the Power Principle. Even in the 7th circle of hell, fascism, there remains a rebellious postulation.
Sure.
It's not so much to mean that like one finds a positive or negative aspect in fascism to use, as if like Laruelle was a fascist sympathizer, but rather that like what is it about fascism, not about its badness or goodness, or I don't even want to say goodness because it's obviously bad, it's horrible. What about it that we need to move past in our relations of politics and our relations of power in the first place?
Yeah.
And what do we do with that? What do we use it for? It might sound alienating to a lot of anti-fascist sympathizers like myself and like everything like that, but it is a very provocative statement. So a lot of this is related to the kind of questions that you've asked already, like the notion of totality and universalization. It's going to go back to this. Yeah. Like I think that a totality would be saying, oh no, we got to bracket off. Like you can't touch fascist thinkers. You can't like. I know for several years Nietzsche was like blacklisted in France because he was quote unquote a Nazi sympathizer, but you know this is what happens when you have a sister who takes over your estate, you know. But the thing is, I think the notion of universalization allows for in non-philosophy to kind of materialize the kinds of givens that are given throughout different iterations, different universals of philosophy, you know, like I said before, language, history, sexuality, power, and all these other things. And to kind of like start from a basis of impoverishment, like the one is without clothes. It's kind of like, you know, it's not woven a fabric. It doesn't provide the conditions of possibility. It's just absolute, like radical impoverishment. It's destituted. It's dispossessed and everything like that. And it's void of all empirical and given contents. So the notion of the one in philosophy also just loses its kind of like in clothing, as it were.
Yeah.
So it starts from this notion of radical impoverishment. And I think that it's useful to think that way, especially to kind of like work through what has been given to kind of start to think this radical impoverishment, to think also moving towards a better situation for the world. And the world is usually capitalized.
Yeah.
There's a thought world, there's a research world, there's all these different types of worlds according to non-philosophy. But the thing that determines a world is between authority and minority, and that the world kind of divides these kinds of things. It's not a matter of dividing constantly. There's a Maoist saying of the one divides into two and the two unifies into one. The one for Laruelle does not divide. It's just a very inseparable kind of like element that unifies all these kinds of things in the first place.
Yeah.
And to kind of use that sort of textual metaphor a little bit further, you know, textile, fabric, all these kinds of things. It's about undoing those kinds of things, to kind of look for the hidden knots and to follow like a kind of like Ariadne's thread of work to kind of tether and develop new ways of mapping and navigating this world that is hell, pretty much. The second question, remind me the second question again, I'm sorry.
We're dealing with, I think it was the unilateral...
unilateral duality and how it is distinct from dialectic.
Yeah.
Okay. Whew. So unilateral duality is a phrase that first appears in Minority Principle and gets developed over time. So it's kind of a way of thinking about causality in a different way. Unilateral means one-sided. But this one-sidedness is also an irreversible causality. So there's a sort of... in philosophy, there are 4 types of causalities: the formal, the material, the affective, and the final. And these are present causes, and then there's the absent cause of Marxism or psychoanalysis, and like Lacan or Althusser and everything like that. But there's a saying by Althusser that the last instance is it never comes.
Yeah.
But it takes that very quite seriously in non-philosophy. Laruelle uses this determination in the last instance to kind of like formalize a way of thinking of radical autonomy. Unilateral duality is holding two terms in suspense, the philosophical and the scientific, and that this kind of relationship between the two is obviously held in suspense, but they're equalized by the one. It's meant to be a way of thinking of who or what this causality is in the first place. And no surprise, I feel like this would cue him in to be anthropocentric or, a humanist or anything like that. But he says man is this last instance that determines science and philosophy. But who is man? Who is the one? Like all these kinds of things, It implies this sort of way of thinking that I think is not stranger to Marxism in a way. That it's that life determines consciousness, and it's not the other way around. It's like it's a manner of thinking that starts from this positionality that has been thought of as the end of man, the death of man, and everything like that. But that he distinguishes between that and the anthropological kind of like connotation of man. So a lot of this is related to how does one think of humankind, humanity, and the notion of man without its gender, its sexual, historical, cultural, racial, kind of like all these different kinds of things in the first place. And in a way to hold all these kinds of things that have been given through science, through philosophy, in suspense.
Yeah.
One of the terms, unilateral duality would later become unified theory. And then from unified theory, it would be the quantum entanglement of things, like wave and particle kind of like distinctions.
Sure.
So this kind of term is, one can juggle as many terms as they want. Either way, there is going to be unilateral causality of things. The duality is just, I guess, a simplistic way of Laruelle to kind of treat these kinds of generalities in a way that lumps them together.
Yeah.
So I think it's a simplicity for duality or dualism in this way, but not so much of a duel, as in like a combat between the two.
Yeah.
So the duel would be the dialectic kind of struggle to resolve and reach a conclusion, but nobody actually reaches a conclusion in a dialectic. There's a very funny line, and stop me if I'm like going on rambling a little bit, but there's a funny line in a lecture that he gave about like class struggle, and how he says that unlike a football match where the referee signals the end of the match, class struggle does not end.
Sure.
People want it to end. They want the struggle to end, and I don't think that's... Laruelle does not want that struggle to end, because if you think of it as an end, then you've already presupposed that limitation. You've already said, like, this is what it ends up like. But it's about struggling and working through these kinds of limitations and reaching not an end, but like a new transformation, a new destination of thought.
Mm-hmm.
So the duality is not meant to be like a duel or like a thing where things are in conflict with one another, or struggling for recognition, or master-slave dialectic or anything like that, but really held in suspense, equalized on a playing field. And I think that the notion of the unilateral duality is it's got its core in Hegel in a way.
Okay.
The notion of one-sidedness, like or something like that. But it's like the notion of one side.
Okay.
But like this is a notion of sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
But there is no sovereignty in the cultural sense of the term of the one.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like this unilateral body, which doesn't have like a physical body or anything like that. It doesn't have a cultural manifestation.
Yeah. So that gives him the possibility to say things like it's non-phenomenal. It doesn't fit into like a phenomenological tradition. It's non-intuitive.
Mm-hmm.
And because the world is guided by, making things fucking intuitive, making them, apparent, it is in that sense stranger. It doesn't belong to the world, yet it is part of it.
Yeah.
Like it haunts it.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's also non-cognitive in a way.
Yeah.
Like the notion of unintelligibility should not also be related to a cognitive sense, but an intuitive sense.
Right.
So this is both for and against Kant and Deleuze in a way, or Spinoza and Kant or anything like that. So it's a manner of holding those two in suspense, cognitive relations and as well as intuitive relations. And yeah, the notion of the stranger, the foreigner, the alien, these are all subject positions for Laruelle in a way that is not meant to be like some sort of heralding or putting on a pedestal kind of thing, but more of like, this is who we are every day in this world.
Yeah.
And without kind of like the real thing that we have to struggle, like it's a thing that we have to struggle not to recognize as ourselves, but to reckon with through our relationship with the world at large. So.
Right, and it does that, or it thinks, as he says, without constituting a system.
Mm-hmm.
So is system, prima facie negative for Laruelle? Or I shouldn't say negative, but like, is it something that belongs to the realm of philosophy that he's trying to get at or trying to problematize?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of the funny things, and this comes up with like Introduction to Generic Sciences. He says, it's kind of like a program, but we will say this is not a program. Like the famous like statements that a lot of revolutionaries or rebels make, like this is not a program.
Yeah.
This is not the revolution will not be televised. All these kinds of things, like in the first place. So I think the notion of a system implies that there is a sort of division of labor, that people like parts and cogs in a machine, like all these different kinds of things. So a system for Laruelle is not so much what it is. There is a really funny mishap in translation that happened while I was at the Theory Center with a bunch of people, and I was translating this text that he wrote on Levinas, and one of the lines in French is "plan-pied," which like means like same foot, but I didn't know what it meant, so I had to Google what it meant. It translated it as bungalow. So like a bungalow of being, a bungalow of philosophy, a bungalow of non-philosophy, all these kinds of things. Like just think of like a one-floor building as a way of like formulating this.
That's funny.
So I think that I think that like a bungalow as opposed to a system would be a better way of phrasing it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's mostly joking, but like it implies this sort of individuality to kind of like somebody's like housing situation or whatever, But it's simple. It's simplistic. There's a sort of like a cutting of the Gordian knot that a lot of systems would put into place in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So the notion of a systematic formulation in non-philosophy, I think that like he's provided a blueprint for these kinds of ways of thinking, but even then it's not systematic in a way. It's it's more methodical, more practical. It's more of a disciplined approach to working with these materials. So as opposed to a system, it's kind of like starting from the pre-system, kind of organizing and everything like that. So it's not systematic in a way. I mean, like you could say that like there's a sort of like construction site in the works.
Yeah.
But people are using the metal bars as monkey bars, so that's how I would view it. You know, it's more of a playground for thought.
I like that.
Yeah,
that's a good way to put it. So I think the last question I have about this, but doesn't mean the last thing we discuss about it, deals with the clone.
Oh, okay.
That for me, and I think this is going to feed well into the generic science when he gives us this discussion about idempotence, where there's almost, like you said, the 1 + 1 = 1. Like the clone doesn't add anything per se, but it adds something in that it reveals that not everything needs to necessarily add something.
Right.
If I can put it in those terms, where he says that the clone is the real transcendental but indivisible identity of, in brackets, a philosophical double. What is he giving us with this? What is that?
A philosophical double. So I think this is also meant to be an argument against a lot of different thinkers at once. So people that come to mind are Girard on the mimetic rivalry,
sure,
Lacan on the semblant or the semblance, and Hegel with the master-slave dialectic. I think that with regards to all three of these instances, you have a notion of recognition, of mimicry, and all these other things. And this is to kind of like circulate back, what is non-philosophy? If it looks like non-philosophy, what does it do? If it does things like philosophy? And I think that like this notion of a mimeticism is a good thing. It's not meant to be a bad thing.
Yeah.
And I think that like this is meant to be a non-Platonic kind of way of conceiving things. So Plato has his whole tirade against mimetic poetry, as opposed to like poetry in its narrative or not true form, or like something like I forget, Plato, this is obviously not my forte, but mimeticism is a bad thing for Plato.
Sure.
Yeah.
Like the cave, I think, alludes to that.
Yeah.
You know, we're not dealing with this simulacral crap. We got to get to the essence of the cathedral.
Yeah. But it's also related to the simulacrum in a way. Like, you know, the notion of the clone has a simulacral power to it.
Yeah.
And it kind of implies a sort of a political aspect to it. So the clone, to kind of go back to this, I think it's meant to be non-additive and non-subtractive. So, like, it seems to me that a clone in a lot of sci-fi literature implies, like, your body's been stolen, this body snatcher or anything like that, or the thing, you know, literally inhabiting the body and mimicry, all these other things. Like, I think that Laruelle is toying with this idea in a way that is science fiction based, but not in a literary sense. Like, this is about inventive possibilities, inventive destinations for how one thinks of subjectivity, how one thinks of the way in which one is in life. So the clone is meant to be a double without a sort of like speciality to it, like a specialness or uniqueness or anything like that. But it implies a sort of individual, but at the same time indivisible kind of entity.
Yeah.
We're all in some way, shape, or form clones of something, you know. There's a sort of like parental kind of like thing that goes on with Laruelle's work, mother and father and everything like that, but like he's not implying some sort of biological birth of the clone or anything like that. The clone is meant to be I'm trying to think of how to think of it this way. Clone is meant to be a material subjectivity that one develops out of the things that have been given. So it takes on an appearance of a philosopher, it takes on the appearance of a scientist, it takes on the appearance of an artist, all these kinds of like subject positions or anything like that. But really though, the essence of the clone is something that is unified with what has preceded it. The clone is meant to be like not so much an extension or anything like that, but it is a transcendent kind of like being from the real.
Yeah.
But in essence, the philosophical double, it's a playful term, I think. You know, it's meant to like scare the shit out of a philosopher. I think in ways that like it also reminds me of a rigori in a way. You know, her form of mimeticism, and looking to subvert the phallo-logocentric kind of like way of perceiving woman.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's any different from that in a way.
Okay.
But this is meant to be a non-gendered identity, like a non-cultural identity or anything like that. So it kind of frees up that subject position to a way that is not necessarily linked to sexual, gender, race, and all these other things.
Yeah.
Things that have been decided upon by the world through all this division in the first place. A clone does imply division, but it's not a division in a way that removes yourself.
Sure.
Or it removes any essence, scare quotes, of yourself from the world.
Yeah,
So,
that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
All right, so now I'll turn it to you, and then I'll leave you to decide if there's anything else about this piece or about non-philosophy generally that you think we haven't touched on that you think is like
the current,
pertinent.
Well, I mean, I think that when it comes to a lot of the Laruelle works, especially the interpretation and the publication and all these other things, and I think this is a good platform for this in the first place, to kind of generalize the audience. You know,
sure.
Like, even though theory and philosophy, you still have to have like some sort of knowledge in some regards. But I think that like when you have an audience that has been mostly academics and working on these kinds of things, it limits the amount of attention that one can give elsewhere. And I think that one of the difficulties that I have with that is that Laruelle in Struggle and Utopia talks about these 5 subject positions of non-philosophers. There's academics, there's mystics, there's heretics, there's analysts in the psychoanalytic tradition,
sure.
and then there are militants. So these come up to be what I call, like, I've called it a couple of times, red stars in the black universe. So they're kind of like equalized points on a star. That could work towards developing this work to be more approachable for everybody to utilize in their everyday lives, and not in the sense of utilization in, like, you know, some sort of you know, like, you got to do this or whatever, you know,
12 rules for life.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not like meant to be like a self-help kind of thing. It's more like, you know, how does one achieve a fusion of theory with the masses? This is something that Marx predicated upon in the second thesis of Feuerbach. You know, the fusion of theory and practice, the fusion of theory and reality, in a way that, like, there is a relationship between the two, and that if the assumption that they are separated from each other is a scholastic question for Marx, and it's an academic question for me.
Yeah.
To assume that there's a split. And I think that a lot of academics presume this split. They presume that we have this institutionalized concrete wall.
Yeah.
What do we do about liberating the things that are actually behind walls, behind firewalls, behind all these kinds of research badges and everything like that?
Yeah.
What do we do to remove the commodification of such knowledges in the first place? How do we make it so that it's practical and useful for people to utilize against their fascist interlocutors, or even more importantly, like not having they're like means. They're the means to an end in a way. So what I'm saying is, in essence, like academics have been, and I say this in the translator's preface to the my bootleg version of Introduction to Generic Sciences, that the academics have been the Stella Maris of the ship.
Yeah.
They've been like pointing to this like North Star in the sea, where there is all this wreckage coming from that direction.
Yeah.
So it's like, what can we do about like the four other subject positions, and how do we raise them up to not the same level, but equalize them all in this last instance of the black universe, as it were?
Yeah.
How does this shimmer, and how does it give hope in a way that like does not render any sort of like mode of like resistance or revolution weak or moot? And what can we do? What is to be done with this non-philosophical material that we've been given?
Yeah.
So it's no surprise for me. Like I have this conviction to kind of work through these problems of subject positions, and kind of like hold a lot of the academics accountable, even though I myself am an academic, you know. But it's, how does one depotentialize or depositionalize that position in the first place? How does one do these kinds of things? And I think non-philosophy allows me to do that. But it's also about raising these other things up to the same caliber, the same level. So I've yet to see a real non-academic text. So I have yet to see a non-textual form of non-philosophy, and I've yet to see a form of non-philosophy that is not appealing to some sort of authority. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the attempts that the non-philosophers have is utilizing this method from Laruelle, but they haven't really let go of that, what I call a principle sufficient of appeal to authority.
Sure.
It's a sort of like appeal to authority that like one gives, but really Laruelle says it best, and Laruelle does not exist. His authority does not exist. But that again is like an authority telling you that he does not exist.
It undoes that.
It undoes that. So it doesn't reach that kind of conclusion for a lot of the people that are very much involved with this. So the thing is with me, and I'm also a part of the problem, since I'm an academic journal editor for Oraxium, a journal of non-philosophy. I forgot to mention that earlier, but that's the plug. But the idea of a non-academic, a militant, or a heretic, or like approach. What does that mean? What does that look like? And all these other things, and it doesn't have a visage. It doesn't have like an appearance. Like it's about undoing that appearance, changing that kind of like thing in the first place. So. I'd say that there's a lot to be done, a lot to be, questioned, and a lot to be taken up. Yeah. And I've yet to see that. I mean, the reception for Laruelle in the Anglophone academia has kind of been like, for the past decade, lumped in with speculative realism and everything like that. So it has yet to see its own day, in a lens that is not supposed to be like another Deleuzean century or a Laruellian century or anything like that. It's how does one actually fucking develop a century where we all are in the same position?
Yeah.
We're all fucked.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how do we change that with the power that we have?
Sure.
And it's the notion of a last refuge. As
Yeah.
it were.
No, it's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
I got the same vibe from it as well.
Yeah.
In different words, because I wouldn't have been able to put it like that, obviously. But yeah, anything else about non-philosophy that is irking you?
Well, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot that irks me, and
well,
but yeah.
How about this? We'll continue on with generic science, and I'm sure that there's enough overlap there that anything that you think of, we'll
come
deal
up
with it.
Yeah.
So then we'll okay. For anyone that listened to this, thank you, and you know how to leave comments. So please do it. I don't care if you subscribe or any of that crap. Just leave comments. That's what's important. I'm going to leave links. What link should I leave? For Araxium? For other things?
Yeah, so you can look on Facebook, Araxium Journal for Non-Philosophy. We also have a website, araxium.org.
Yeah.
That will lead us to the splash page where we have our... we still have like a call for papers up, but we've already received our submissions for it.
Sure.
So we're still like in the peer review period. That's a nightmare.
Oh my god, I can imagine.
Yeah. And you can probably see our mission statement and all these other things. So we have a lot of projects upcoming for that. I'm trying to think of what else. Like, just look around, read some non-philosophy, and if you have any questions, you can shoot me an email.
Yeah.
Through my Western email. It's jsmit747@uwo.ca.
Cool. I'll put that in the description as well.
Yeah.
All right, great. So we'll catch you again next time. Peace.